Welcome to NTD Evening News. Our top story tonight: after spending months longer than planned in space, two NASA astronauts are finally home. Butch Wilmer and Suni Williams hitched a ride aboard a SpaceX Dragon capsule from the International Space Station to Earth and will soon be reunited with their families. Progress toward peace in Ukraine. Russia now agreeing to pause some attacks after a long call between President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. What the leaders announced and how Ukraine's leader is responding. Iris Tao at the White House. Israeli forces strike multiple Hamas targets in the Gaza Strip. This comes after the two sides were unable to reach a deal to extend the ceasefire. Jason Perry reports. The Trump administration is defending the deportation flights of alleged gang members. A district court judge is now ordering a hearing, intensifying the legal back and forth with the administration. Arian Pazdar has the immigration update. And a federal judge orders the Trump administration to restore email access for USAID workers, ruling the agency's shutdown is likely unconstitutional. The latest development in the DOJ legal battles.
This is NTD Evening News, live from our global headquarters in New York City. Here's Tiffany Meyer.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. After spending months longer than planned in space, two NASA astronauts are finally home and will soon be reunited with their families. Butch Wilmer and Suni Williams hitched a ride aboard a SpaceX Dragon capsule from the International Space Station to Earth. They splashed down in the Gulf of America off the coast of Florida just moments ago. The duo spent more than 280 days aboard the ISS. What was supposed to be an 8-day mission was extended after NASA deemed the Boeing Starliner they rode up to space in unfit for the return journey due to propulsion issues and helium leaks. SpaceX CEO Elon Musk and President Trump have accused the Biden administration of abandoning the duo in space. Wilmer and Williams rode back to Earth with a fellow NASA astronaut and a Russian cosmonaut. They'll all stay at the Johnson Space Center for a routine debrief that all astronauts go through when they come home. Pausing attacks on Ukraine's energy and infrastructure, that's what Russian President Vladimir Putin agreed to after a lengthy call with President Trump. But Russia still has demands, and Ukraine wants more details. Joining us now live is NTD's White House correspondent Iris Tao. Good evening, Iris. What was and was not achieved during the high-level talks today?
Good evening to you, Tiff. So after talking for about an hour and a half today, President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin agreed that Russia will now pause its attacks on Ukraine's energy and infrastructure for 30 days. It comes after the White House the day before says they're on the 10-yard line of peace. Watch.
We are on the 10th yard line of peace, and we've never been closer to a peace deal than we are in this moment. And the president, as you know, is determined to get one done.
While both leaders agree that there needs to be what they call lasting peace, there's no indication in either side's readout that Russian President Vladimir Putin has agreed to a broader 30-day ceasefire deal that President Trump has endorsed and Ukraine has said yes to. President Trump did say in the afternoon, though, that they are working quickly toward a complete ceasefire, and the White House says such negotiations will take place immediately in the Middle East.
And Iris, what did the Kremlin say about the call today? How is Ukraine responding?
So the Kremlin in its readout mentioned something that the White House's readout did not mention, which is that Putin demanded that military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine be halted as a condition for what they call the prevention of the escalation of further conflict. Meanwhile, on the Ukraine side, President Volodymyr Zelensky responded saying that they agreed to an energy ceasefire, but he also wants more details about what exactly was discussed today during the call as he wasn't briefed on the details, adding that he wants to talk to Trump on the phone. Watch.
Ми ж підтримуємо всі кроки щодо закінчення війни. Ми і будемо підтримувати, але для того, щоб щось підтримувати, треба розуміти, що конкретно.
And Zelensky also added that he does not want Ukrainian allies to actually pause their military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine. It's unclear, though, how the U.S. will act next. Remember, just about 2 weeks ago, the U.S. did once pause its military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine after that contentious Oval meeting right here at the White House. And that's, of course, before resuming them last week. Tiff.
And Iris, in addition to upcoming negotiations between the U.S. and Russia, what else are we expecting to see next?
Sure. So as part of the outcome of today's call between Trump and Putin, Kremlin says on Wednesday they will have a prisoner exchange with Ukraine involving 175 people on both sides, including Russia will give back Ukraine some of its wounded Ukrainian soldiers. And also in the long term, when it comes to the U.S., the White House announces that as part of the conversation today, both leaders have agreed to improve U.S.-Russia relations, including what they call enormous economic deals when peace is achieved. Tiff.
All right, Iris, thanks for those updates. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle favorably view the Trump administration's attempt to end the Russia-Ukraine war. Our Washington correspondent Luis Martinez has more on the story.
Even with an unbelievable amount of effort by the United States, where there's been spring offensive, there's been tanks, there's been additional weaponry, there's been advanced weaponry, that line has not moved. If this was just set to continue, we would see a war of attrition and perhaps ultimately Russia marching across Ukraine and an ultimate loss by Ukraine.
Since 2022, Congress has approved over $170 billion in aid for Ukraine through 5 supplemental appropriations, but the appetite to continue funding the defense of Ukraine is waning on Capitol Hill.
They could have had peace a long time ago if they wanted it. In this particular case, if Mr. Putin is changing his mind and he is recognizing the damage that it's doing to his economy, the damage that it's done to his military already, and he's now looking for a way out, as long as it is an enforceable peace, then I think we might be able to move forward.
Congressional Democrats have softened their opposition to President Trump's approach to peace negotiations in between Russia and Ukraine, but have demanded that the terms of a settlement provide for a just peace for Ukraine.
Look, I was one of the few people who, with the Congressional Progressive Caucus, said that we should have diplomacy years ago. And I appreciate the desire for peace, but it has to be a just peace. It can't be telling Zelensky to give up a part of his country.
I'm glad they've taken that step. I'm glad the administration is now intelligence sharing again with Ukraine, and I'm glad that we've unpaused the aid to Ukraine. So I'm glad they've reversed course on all those things. And if Russia doesn't agree to it, then the administration needs to see that it is Russia that wants to continue the war, to continue the killings, as the president says.
Despite the changing winds within the Democratic conference, there is still not a consensus as to what a just peace looks like. Instead, Democratic Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries and Democratic Minority Leader Chuck Schumer have pivoted to national politics while they define their strategy.
Sunday, we had a good conversation about the path forward, particularly as it relates to making sure we all speak with one voice in the effort to stop these Medicaid cuts from ever being enacted into law.
And it's worth noting that some lawmakers within the Republican conference, like Congressman Thomas Massie, argue that the Russia-Ukraine war and the conflicts in the Middle East are wars that the U.S. should not be involved in. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
In a breaking development, Israeli forces have resumed airstrikes against Hamas terrorists in the Gaza Strip. This comes after the two sides were unable to agree on a deal to extend the ceasefire and release more hostages. NTD's Jason Perry has the details.
Residents in the Gaza Strip were seen scrambling to find survivors after Israel resumed airstrikes throughout the territory on Tuesday. Israeli forces released footage showing strikes on several targets in the Gaza Strip. Israel's government spokesman David Mincer explained.
Hamas has rejected 2 concrete mediation proposals presented by the U.S. presidential envoy, Mr. Steve Witkoff, and other mediators. Secondly, Israel has knowledge that Hamas was planning to carry out terrorist attacks against Israel. Hamas was using the ceasefire to build up its forces and rearm to re-attack.
Israel reported killing the head of the Hamas government in the Gaza Strip and 3 other senior members of the terrorist group, including the head of Hamas's internal security forces, which Israel said was used for terrorist activity. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the possibility of civilian casualties during the operations.
We target Hamas terrorists. And when these terrorists embed themselves in civilian areas, when they use civilians as human shields, they're the ones who are responsible for all unintended casualties. Palestinian civilians should avoid any contact with Hamas terrorists.
Israel also reported sending out evacuation orders in Arabic to the residents to move away from certain locations, including parts of the southern Gaza Strip.
The situation is very hard and very bad. We didn't want it to reach this point and for the fighting to return like that. We were happy with the ceasefire, but praise be to God.
And also from areas in the northern Gaza Strip.
What is happening with us is not right. Why is our life disrupted while all other countries are doing well?
This comes as 59 hostages are still being held captive in the Gaza Strip, fewer than half of whom are believed to still be alive. Israel's defense minister, Israel Katz, gave a warning to Hamas on Tuesday.
Hamas must understand that the rules of the game have changed, and if it does not immediately release all the kidnapped men and women, the gates of hell will open, and it will find the full might of the IDF in the air, at sea, and on land facing it until it is completely destroyed.
Meanwhile, Qatar's prime minister and Egypt's foreign ministry both called for an immediate ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. Jason Perry, NTD News.
President Trump today criticizing a judge who ordered the return of alleged gang members to the United States. That says Trump is calling on illegal immigrants to self-deport. NTD's international correspondent Arian Pazdar is in Latin America with the immigration update.
President Trump is urging illegal immigrants to self-deport from the United States. Now, Trump says immigrants should use the newly released CBP Home app. Now, this app replaced the Biden-era CBP One app, which some immigrants use to enter the United States.
People in our country illegally can self-deport the easy way, or they can get deported the hard way, and that's not pleasant.
Under the Biden administration, some immigrants use the CBP One app to schedule appointments at ports of entry to be paroled into the United States. Earlier this month, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem said this allowed more than 1 million aliens to illegally enter the United States. With the launching of the CBP Home app, we are restoring integrity to our immigration system. Trump says immigrants who self-deport using the CBP Home app might be allowed to return to the U.S. in the future.
They could potentially have the opportunity to return legally at some point in the future. But if they do not avail themselves of this opportunity, then they will be found, they will be deported, and they will never be admitted again.
Meanwhile, the Trump administration is in a legal battle with Judge James Boasberg. On Saturday evening, Boasberg ordered the Trump administration to stop deporting immigrants under the Alien Enemies Act, even ordering airborne flights to turn around and return to the U.S. However, 3 flights deported alleged gang members on that day. Now on Tuesday, the administration submitted a court filing explaining that 2 of those planes departed U.S. territory and airspace before the written order, claiming they were not subject to it. And the 3rd plane departed after that time, but all individuals on that 3rd plane had Title VIII final removal orders and thus were not removed solely on the basis of the Alien Enemies Act, claiming they're also not subject to the written order. Also on Tuesday, Trump criticized Boasberg, saying, "I'm just doing what the voters wanted me to do. This judge should be impeached." Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts responded to the Post, issuing a rare public statement. He says for more than 2 centuries, it has been established that impeachment is not an appropriate response to disagreement concerning a judicial decision. Judge Boasberg has now scheduled a hearing for the case against the administration for Friday afternoon. Arian Pazdar, NTD News.
A federal judge has granted an injunction brought by recently fired employees of the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID. The order comes amid efforts by Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency to cut the federal workforce. U.S. District Court Judge Theodore Chuang ruled that DOJ's move to shutter USAID likely violated the Constitution by effectively eliminating an agency created by Congress. Chuang ordered the Trump administration to restore email and computer access to all agency employees who had been placed on leave. Trump issued an executive order on Inauguration Day directing a freeze of foreign assistance and a review of all U.S. aid and development work abroad. The president and his allies argue much of the funding is wasteful and against U.S. interests. The Trump administration acknowledging for the first time in court filings that 25,000 recently hired federal workers had been let go and said federal agencies were working to bring all of them back. That's after a judge ruled their terminations were likely illegal. That's as the Defense Department announced today that it will be cutting 5 to 8% of their civilian staff. NTD correspondent Jason Blair reports.
Court documents show that 24,805 federal employees have been let go so far under the Trump administration, and this is across 18 different agencies. So this is the first time that some of these agencies have reported some official numbers, and this is the first time also that we have a good idea of exactly how many employees have been let go so far under the Department of Government Efficiency efforts. In a court case on March 13th, judges ruled that these let-go employees must be reinstated, saying that the actions likely violated personnel rules because no advance notice was provided.
I would suspect that we're going to have to get a decision from the Supreme Court. These are people, in many cases, they don't show up for work. Nobody even knows if they exist. And a judge wants us to pay them even if they don't know they exist. If they exist.
And according to a senior defense official, the Department of Defense plans on letting go about 50 to 60,000 or 5 to 8% of its civilian workforce by simply not replacing people who routinely leave. One concern that was brought up is, are these jobs now going to be filled by service members? The senior defense officials said that according to Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, he wants to ensure that these civilian cuts do not hurt military readiness. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Jason Blair, NTD News.
Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Joining us now to discuss the key takeaways from President Trump's phone call today with Russian President Vladimir Putin is Gregory Copley, president of the International Strategic Studies Association. Gregory, thank you so much for joining us. Good to see you again. Now, the White House and Kremlin each released a readout of the call. President Trump said it was very good and productive, and that President Putin has agreed to a 30-day ceasefire on energy infrastructure, not the complete ceasefire Trump wanted. Do you think Putin is turning out to be a tougher negotiator than Trump would like?
No, I don't think so. I think we're now moving to the stage where President Putin and President Trump are in basic agreement. They are moving carefully towards a ceasefire. The only doubt is really President Volodymyr Zelensky, who has basically walked away from agreements to move this process forward. I think he's more or less on board now, but what we have seen with this phone call today is that President Trump and President Putin have re-established or normalized relations now between Moscow and Washington. And that's critical because you need to know that there are no other problems in the wings. So now we are moving forward with everybody in a pretty sincere sort of dialogue, cutting back on the major attacks, like attacks on the infrastructure, energy infrastructure in Ukraine. I think it's going to be a very good token of goodwill. The question is now, what are the negotiating positions going to be going forward? Russia has very little to worry about in that regard. It doesn't have to give up a lot. The Ukrainians basically thought that they had a negotiating lever with their occupation of parts of Kursk, but that's fallen apart. So basically now it's going to be about how do both leaders find face-saving ways to, if you like, appear to come to an agreement. And that's going to be harder for President Zelensky than it is for President Putin.
Now, in terms of the readout, one area both agreed on was the Middle East. The White House readout saying this is a region, quote, of potential cooperation to prevent future conflicts, and going on to say that both leaders believe Iran should never be in a position to destroy Israel. What do you make of that? How does the Middle East play into this?
Well, the Middle East obviously is very close to Ukraine when you think about it, and it's very close to the Black Sea and to Turkey. And Turkey is the main destabilizing threat these days. It's not only threatening to dominate Iran, because Iran has been comprehensively beaten militarily by Israel, but Turkey now controls Syria. So we now see that whole movement going forward, and both Russia and the US basically have some leverage each over Turkey. So we're going to see now whether that cooperation extends the overall closeness, if you like, between Moscow and Washington going forward. I think what we're seeing with all of this, including the Ukraine settlement, is that the US is moving geopolitically into a position toward the East, as the Eastern Mediterranean, Eastern Europe and the like, and possibly with a security de facto position in Ukraine. And that is something which takes away the need for NATO and its old mission. So that's going to be very significant. And the NATO states, and particularly the so-called coalition of the willing who want to keep the Ukraine war going, including the UK, are going to be somewhat disconcerted by President Trump's moves, which moves the US a little bit further away from NATO.
Now, another area was talk of a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea. What would that look like? What would each side be giving up to achieve that?
Well, I think that's something that the Russians perhaps want more than the Ukrainians, because that's been an area where the Ukrainian armed forces have been more successful than the Russians. The Russian old-style Black Sea fleet has found itself very vulnerable in those contained waters to, shall we say, unconventional Ukrainian approaches to attacking ships. And they've been very effective. So Russia does not want to lose more ships in that area. And so it wants that sort of ceasefire. But it's offered to give up a lot of its attacks in the short term on the energy infrastructure of Ukraine, which is particularly vulnerable to Russia.
And Gregory, if an unconditional ceasefire deal is reached, how might it be enforced to ensure lasting peace?
Well, nothing ensures lasting peace. Treaties are always of a limited duration. They either are for a fixed term or they expire based on their lack of utility, like the START talks and the like. Basically, there has to be a stable peace based on a mutuality of interests and a lack of threats on both sides. The position of the US saying that if it invests heavily in Ukrainian mineral exploitation and the like and other means, it will have such an interest in Ukraine that it would be difficult for Russia to threaten that in the future. So it provides a de facto security umbrella, which I think is much better and more durable and more flexible than an explicit security guarantee such as NATO and the like. What we've seen with NATO is that it nominally has a situation where each state must defend the interests of each other NATO state. And Turkey had tried to use that to get NATO to declare war on Israel, for example.
All right, Gregory Copley, thank you as always so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Around the side hatch. This helps to ensure that the side hatch itself, the edges of it incur no damage while crew members are coming out from the spacecraft. If you missed it, there was also a recovery team member that went inside. So there are now 5 people on board the Dragon spacecraft.
And if you are just joining us, it has not yet even been an hour since Crew 9 splashed down off the coast of Tallahassee, Florida at 2:57 p.m. Pacific time. The crew is now on board the recovery vessel Megan, and the hatch is open. The next major milestone that we'll see is when the crew will actually egress or exit the spacecraft. But before that, they'll continue to, the recovery personnel rather, will continue to install that protective area around the hatch and then remove the footrests. So we're a couple minutes away from seeing the crew egress, but not too long away.
We'll probably see those footrests being handed out here in the near future, as I mentioned before. Oh, of course, we got to get a well-documented photo of the moment. Although we can't see it from here, I'm pretty sure there are 4 smiles on board right now.
And we did hear that report out from the commander, Nick Hague, following splashdown, that there were four smiles as far as he could see.
Yeah, capsule full of grins. Now, generally speaking,
and there we do see Crew 9, some happy waves, smiles all around back on Earth.
Generally speaking, we have the individuals in the 2 center seats of the spacecraft exit first. You might hear us refer to this as the exit process as egress. It's just another term for exiting the spacecraft. Generally speaking, we most of the time have the 2 center seats egress first, as it makes moving around inside the capsule a little bit easier. We can see the tablets that were previously located on the upper leg of the crew members. We can see those being handed out to the recovery team. Those were taken off prior to the entry phase, to spacecraft reentry. Those had to be stored and secured prior to dynamic operations.
It looks like we are starting to see the footrests also be removed. I just saw one there on the screen. There are 4, of course, 1 for each crew member.
Those footrests are made out of carbon fiber and are actually sized appropriately for each crew member, as everybody has different measurements and different leg lengths. Same goes for the armrests and the bucket length of each seat. We size those appropriately for the crew members and to ensure their comfort and safety. I believe we just saw the little ramp that is used to help slide the crew members out from inside the spacecraft.
And once the crew does exit Dragon Freedom, they will be placed on to a stretcher to go to a medical bay for medical checkouts. This is standard procedure for all Dragon spacecraft flights that splash down crewed, as well as for our Soyuz spacecraft that land in Kazakhstan.
We can see the exterior of Dragon Freedom quite clearly in this shot, and it's such a beautiful sight. I personally prefer the capsule when it has some of that charring from atmospheric reentry. It is the signature sign of a capsule that has returned to Earth.
Continuing to stand by for our first crew member to egress or exit Crew Dragon Freedom following their splashdown at 2:57 p.m. Pacific time. Dragon undocked from the International Space Station at 10:05 p.m. Pacific just yesterday, so it was about 17 hours of phasing. And while on board the International Space Station, Crew 9 contributed to 900 hours of science, over 150 research experiments and investigations, making great use of the microgravity lab of the International Space Station, which celebrates 25 years of continuous human presence this November.
Looks like we're about to get our first crew member here upon egress of the Dragon spacecraft.
So we are standing by for that egress. Outside of Dragon, you do see one of those stretchers. This is the expected procedure as the crew will be taken to medical facilities following their exit from Dragon.
We can see folks on board clapping as our first crew member.
And that is NASA astronaut Nick Hague, commander of Crew 9, now out of Crew Dragon Freedom. Some smiles, thumbs up, and a wave. Can't get any better than that.
Yeah, that is one happy camper, that's for sure. As we said before, it is standard procedure for all of our long-duration crew members to receive assistance upon egressing from the spacecraft. We basically help them move off of the recovery deck and into the private medical quarters for their initial consultation with the SpaceX flight surgeon. So we'll see that take place for all 4 of our crew members today.
And we are standing by for the next crew member to exit Freedom. Next up, out of the capsule, we expect Roscosmos cosmonaut Alexander Gorbanov. His first space flight. Spent 171 days in space alongside NASA astronaut Nick Hague.
Looks like we're getting some cheers and clapping on board as Alexander is slid down the little ramp and placed into the mobility aid. Once again, big smile.
Now, the 2 crew members remaining in Dragon are NASA astronauts Sunny Williams and Butch Wilmore. They completed 286 days in space.
One of the remaining footrests being removed from the Dragon spacecraft. As I said before, we generally try to have the crew members that are located in the 2 center seats aboard Dragon, and we like to have them egress first if possible, as it creates a little bit more movable working room inside the spacecraft. There is a recovery crew member inside that is helping all of our Crew 9 crew egress or exit from the spacecraft.
We are standing by for the next crew member to egress or exit Crew Dragon Freedom following the splashdown not even an hour ago at 2:57 p.m. Pacific time. Really have the recovery operations down pretty quick at this point.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible to think that, just 5 years ago when we were doing the initial demonstration missions of the Dragon for Crew Dragon, that now we're under about 30 minutes for, to retrieve the spacecraft from the water, and just several minutes here while it's been on board, and to get everyone, really to get that side hatch open. For those of you that have just recently joined, the Dragon had an on-time splashdown. It looks like we're getting our next crew member here. That is none other than Sunny Williams. Big smile, big waves. She, like her other crew members, now will be assisted onto the mobility aid.
There we have it, some waves, some thumbs up, and some smiles.
Definitely seems to be a theme among all recovery operations.
Absolutely. And of course, that leaves NASA astronaut Butch Wilmore inside Dragon in seat 4. We're getting some views of him now as he egresses or exits the spacecraft.
Once again, some elation and cheers there from Butch Wilmore. As we mentioned before, returning to Earth coming from a microgravity environment can wreak havoc on the body. So it is customary and just standard procedure for all of our long-term space residents to get assistance once they are back on board the recovery vessel.
And there you have it, Butch Wilmore and Sunny Williams back home after 286 days in space. Quite incredible. And now for your sports news, we're joined by NTD's Dave Martin. Could you imagine being in space for 9 months when you thought it was 8 days?
I mean, all the sports you'd miss, How rough would that be?
Speaking of sports, let's not miss any. So plenty going on right now, but let's start in college basketball as the first 4 round of the NCAA tournament starts tonight with North Carolina among the schools in action. Now, this seems to be a somewhat ignored part of the tournament. Why is that?
You know, for one thing, it's generally lower seeded teams that play a lot of these smaller schools. In fact, the reason the NCAA expanded the field from 64 to 65 teams in 2001 was to accommodate the Mountain West, the newly formed Mountain West Conference, to give them an automatic bid. So instead of taking one of the at-large bids away, though, they just add this little play-in round between a couple of 16 seeds that was very ignored by everyone. In fact, they didn't even bother televising these games for a number of years. In 2011, though, they added 4 more teams. You're up to 68 teams, which meant 4 play-in games. And Virginia Commonwealth that year became the first of those teams playing in the play-in round of the first 4 round to actually make it all the way to the Final Four. I think that's actually started to give this round a lot more coverage. So that is going to be on TV tonight on True TV. It'll be first it's Alabama State versus St. Francis, and then we've got North Carolina versus San Diego State. So be sure to watch.
Well, looking at baseball news, the Dodgers beat the Cubs early this morning over in Japan to open the season. They'll play again tomorrow. When do the rest of the teams start their seasons?
Yeah, it's not until next week. It's actually a week from Thursday, March 27. Basically, I think they want to give these guys, a chance to recover from any jet lag, before continuing the season. Because when the Dodgers and Cubs return after tomorrow's game, they go back to playing spring training games as well. So it's just a 2-game series over there. I mean, it's no coincidence. Of course, these two teams have several Japanese stars on them, none bigger than Shohei Ohtani, of course. Now, Ohtani still isn't pitching, but he is hitting. He had a single and a double yesterday, scored 2 runs in their 4-1 win. Now, meanwhile, the Dodgers were also without Mookie Betts, and also because of illness. Also, Freddie Freeman, their all-star first baseman, he was scratched because of left rib discomfort, which is actually recurrent of the same injury he had in last year's World Series, which, that can't be good. Now, tomorrow, though, the Dodgers start top prospect Roki Sasaki, who just came over from Japan. That game starts at 6:10 a.m. Eastern time, so be sure to set your alarm clock.
No sleep, I guess, and I'm watching that game tonight and then in the morning. Well, shifting gears to the NBA, last night comedian and New York Knicks fan Tracy Morgan caused a 10-minute delay when he vomited on the court at Madison Square Garden during the 3rd quarter. How is he doing?
Yeah, apparently he's doing better. He actually posted a quote on social media today, an update. Let's go ahead and show that there. He said, "Thank you all for your concern. I'm doing okay now. Doctors say it was food poisoning. I appreciate my MSG family for taking such good care of me, and I need to shout out the crew that had to clean that up. I appreciate you." Now he goes on here. "More importantly, the Knicks are now 1-0 when I throw up on the court, so maybe I'll have to break it out again in the playoffs." Of course, the Knicks are in 3rd place in the Eastern Conference. They are definitely primed to hit the playoffs, so we'll have to see if he breaks out his secret weapon come postseason time.
Gosh, well, Dave, as always, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Tiff.
And that's all for today's news. For round-the-clock coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Good night.